if you can just show me, broadly, I think we might be able to divide this audience into 3 groups. People who are highly sceptical of this issue, don't think there's anything to worry about, but are open-minded enough to come today. People who are concerned parents and worried about their children. People who are health practitioners and would like to bring this into their area of expertise, practicing with health, and may also be seeing patients with electromagnetic hypersensitivity. And in that same bracket, I'll put people who do actually have electromagnetic hypersensitivity. So, as in 1, 2, and 3, 1 skeptics, 2 interested in children, and 3 interested more in EHS and management. Can I just see a show of hands for 1? Excellent. 2? Okay, and 3? That's kind of what I expected. I always, and you may fall into a number of groups, I realise. I'm always disappointed at how few skeptics there are, because in a way that's where I'm best suited. I come from a very cynical environment where we must be sceptical about everything, which in some cases can be very healthy. It makes us very discerning. And I think often I lecture to that audience best because that's my background. But I will try to bear that in mind as we go through. And I might zoom through some of these areas so that we can focus a bit more on therapy and management towards the end, because at the moment that's one of the smaller sections. So this is a group, FIRE, that I set up a few years ago now because, to be honest, once I moved into this area of research, I became overwhelmed with people asking for information. I really couldn't keep up with it all. So I am now looking for doctors to join me and associated specialists so that we can, stands for Physicians' Health Initiative for Radiation and Environment. And you'll find on our website, which is back on there at the bottom there, firemedical.org, some free information to help move things forward, and that will be continuously updated. And to briefly go through what I'm hoping to cover if we have time, I'll introduce the subject very quickly. So I'll talk about what we're here to discuss, a little bit of philosophy, and I'll keep that brief, but I think it's relevant possibly to some of your questions. A brief history of some of the really relevant fast facts about EMF and health. And when I say EMF, I mean electromagnetic fields. Cancer concerns. Normally I don't focus on this because, in my opinion, health-wise, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. It's only one health effect, but it's quite topical. There's been an interesting amount of news and press about this recently, so I felt I should cover it. And then a quick overview of some of the other health concerns, a note on vulnerable groups, and this is where we'll talk a bit about children and people with EHS. And then moving forward with health first, and that's where we'll focus on some of the practical solutions. And I'll say now, in case I forget at the end, if we don't have time to do enough on practical solutions, there's another video on my website, if you go to videos about EHS, that is all about solutions. It's called Practical Solutions, and it goes into a lot more detail about how to practically help solve this problem. So this is the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's broad, and you'll recognise a lot of what's on here. Ionizing radiation comprises ultraviolet radiation, X-rays, gamma rays, cosmic rays, and many of you will be aware that that has been associated with carcinogenesis or cancer formation. Until reasonably recently, many people thought that the non-ionizing portion, everything below that with the lower frequencies and longer wavelengths, was relatively inert, not particularly interactive with biology. But we really know now that that's not true. All parts of this spectrum can affect health, can disrupt biology, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a negative way. And we're going to talk quite a lot in this presentation today about this part, the radio frequency part, the microwave part. This is where we use a lot of our mobile communication devices. Another part of the spectrum that's of great interest to me is further down even, down here at household electrical wiring. In this country, that's only 50 hertz that you would associate with power lines and things, electric trains, but also just all the devices in your house, the common household devices. So if we can touch on this, and feel free to ask me questions about that portion as well. So the radio microwave portion, you'll be familiar with all of these devices, cordless landlines, your mobile phones, your laptops, anything really that communicates wirelessly tends to use this, including baby monitors. And what some of you in the room may be aware of is that this certificate was issued back in 2011 by the World Health Organization and the International Agency for Research on Cancer, classifying the type of radiation that those devices emit as a group 2B or possible human carcinogen. That means they think it may cause cancer in humans. I'm going to come back to this, but I wanted to introduce it early on because this is going to be part of the topic of conversation. This is Hippocrates, and well known to those of us who choose medicine because of his proclamation that we should first do no harm, which is quite an obvious principle in medicine. But I'm concerned that we now need to be embracing this principle in other places, like places of work and places of education and schools. And it's really pivotal to some of the philosophy behind this talk. I think we all know what science is. In this definition from the Oxford English Dictionary, it's a systematic study of the natural world through observation and experiment. But it's sometimes useful to consider what is not science. There's not really an opposite of science, but in modern philosophy of science, and particularly people who think about the Karl Popper principle, you can sometimes define it as something that can't be falsified. I don't want you to think too deeply about that, because it can get a bit confusing, but I may come back to this principle later on. So things that are considered scientific, it means, loosely speaking, there is some way of proving it or disproving it, but you can arrive at an answer. Now, science, when I started my career, I was extremely naive, and when I read scientific papers, to me, that was black and white. That was evidence. And then I started reading more papers, and I realised that a lot of this evidence was conflicting, and it all sounded excellent. And you start getting confused, and you think, well, how can I discern the truth from not the truth? And what I started to realise is this. Science is a very useful tool, but it's a tool used by and created by humans, and it is subject to the same bias that is present in all of us. So it only has the integrity or purity of the humans that constructed it. It's therefore subject to bias, as many other things in life are. And some people, well, you can falsify a theory with one study alone. Again, this is the Karl Popper principle, but if you can clearly, truly find an example of where a theory fails, then you have successfully falsified it. We like more than that, and I think that's healthy to some extent. We like to be really sure, so we often ask for tons of studies, but that's an important principle. Another important principle, I think, is that a positive study isn't directly counterbalanced by a negative one. And what I mean by this is common sense, but if I were to give you 10 papers and say, well, 5 of them showed evidence of harm, and 5 of them failed to show evidence of harm, they don't cancel each other out. You don't therefore say, oh, there's no evidence of harm, there's nothing to be concerned about. And although that's common sense, this is an argument that's been used quite a lot in this debate to try and get rid of the positive evidence. Consistency is not to be expected. And what I mean by that is in nature, we're looking at biological systems. They're non-linear, they're unpredictable. We often don't fully understand them from start to finish. And so we don't need all of the papers to show harm. In fact, we don't even need a majority of papers to show harm. If some show harm, that's of concern and needs further investigation. And when we talk about evidence, there's lots of different types of evidence, and it's meaningful on different levels. Something that my grandmother would consider scientific and accept full-heartedly, somebody who spent their career dedicated to this subject may not. But loosely speaking, these types of evidence, empirical and physical, which are quite similar, it's evidence that you yourself can assimilate using your own senses, something you can see or you can hear or you can taste. And statistical evidence, which is the same sort of thing put into numbers. This is what we consider to be stronger in the scientific world. And if you can gather that firsthand, each one of you, I'd like you to think for a moment about something you know is fact, that you absolutely 100% know. And the chances are that if you know it, it's because you have first-hand evidence. You experienced it yourself. And that, again, can be highly relevant to this debate. If it's not first-hand, then you have to think about the source. If you're getting it from somebody else, then how reliable is that source? There's very little information in life, quite often, that we think we know that actually is first-hand. And I think this is the last point I'm going to make on the philosophical side. But this is something called the Bradford Hill criteria for causality. and invented by Austin Bradford Hill in the 60s. This remains really robust in the scientific and medical world. I use this through my training, and I still do. We use it to try and determine whether A causes B. And you don't have to satisfy all 9 of these criteria to be fairly certain that A causes B, but the more that you satisfy, the more certain you can be. And the only one that is absolutely 100% necessary, this is common sense, is number 4. A must precede B in order to be the cause of B. So that's about timing or temporality. And I'd ask you to remember that because that's going to be relevant later on. That, every time you see that ball, that's the question time. And that doesn't mean you need to ask questions, but if you've got something relevant to that point, I'll take a question, then we'll move on.
I just wanted to know if all of this is available on the website, so I know whether to take photos or...
So a lot of people have asked me this question recently, and the website for our group is fairly new, so it's not on there yet, but I'm going to endeavour in the next month to get it on there. And I've got lots of slides, so I'll be dividing them up into different subject headings. So yeah, this will be on there. Any other questions? Okay. So I said I'd give you some fast facts about the background of this subject that I think will be useful to you. This is a big one, and I'm going to answer it in a very simplistic fashion as a medical doctor from my previous life in clinical medicine. You'll all be aware of these. This is an electrocardiogram, an ECG. This is the brain waves. This is an EEG. This is an action potential of a muscle contracting. And all of these are showing the same thing. They're showing an electromagnetic field which is emanating from your body. Your brain is electromagnetic, and it sends impulses down wiring that's very similar to household wiring. It's insulated in a myelin sheath, and it's an electrical signal. Your heart does the same thing. And in fact, your DNA is a fractal antenna, so we don't just put out fields. We're also designed to receive them, and that helps cue our biorhythms like our circadian rhythm, etc. So back in the emergency room, if you have somebody there that has no outward signs of life, and this does sometimes happen, we've got a phrase that we say, you're not dead until you're warm and dead. And the reason for that is people can drown, for example, in icy cold waters, have no visible sign of life, but there is still life there, and we can bring it back with hard enough work. So what I'm saying here is that very crudely, to a doctor, we can say that life can be the presence or absence of electromagnetism in a human organism. And that tells you something about how important it is to a living being. And that's the same of the entire living world. And now these creatures, I've selected some of these deliberately. These are airborne species, aquatic species, and landborne creatures, including ourselves. They all have specialized particles, things like magnetite and cryptochromes, which are actually deliberately designed to use electromagnetic fields to their advantage for things like navigation or migration or finding prey, etc. And when we're talking about this subject, quite often people will try to allay concerns about some of the increases that we're seeing in ambient radiation, and they'll say, there's no need to be concerned because we evolved in an electromagnetic field. It's always been there. And they are partially correct. It has always been there, but nothing like the field that we have created. We've created a field that in terms of signal strength or power density can be shown to be up to 10 to the 18 times. That's technically, I think, a billion or a quintillion times higher than the evolutionary signal strengths of background radiation. And this has happened really fast. In evolutionary terms, this has happened in the blink of an eye or the beat of a heart. It's happened in my lifetime. I was born in 1975, and you see this exponential looking curve which continues to escalate at this rate. Now, it's not just signal strength. I was talking there about power. That's not the only thing that's dramatically different. You'll see from this graph in green here, this is natural background radiation that we evolved in, and you'll see how it dips at about 1 gigahertz. So that was a natural radio quiet zone. That was where there wasn't very much radiation. And that is the very area that we've decided to fill in. You can see 50s, 80s, 2010. That's where we've decided to use that portion of the spectrum and create these much higher signal strengths. So you would hope, given all this information, that as we were evolving in this technological era, that there would be safety guidelines, safety limits to protect health and to be absolutely sure that there can be no negative effects. Unfortunately, there are not in this country. The only limits or safety standards that we have were devised back in the 90s, and they were devised only to protect against tissue heating. That means quite literally cooking like you would in a microwave, increasing the temperature of your cells. Again, I think this is kind of common sense, but we now know that there are many, many effects, serious effects, that can happen orders of magnitude below that temperature or thermal heating effect. And we haven't developed guidelines to protect against those. And this is us. This is kind of embarrassing, I think, over here. These are all the other countries that have dramatically lowered their safety limits to try to protect against some of these biological effects. And in fact, even in these other countries, there is often debate that those levels are set too high. And roughly that comprises almost half the world. It's sort of 48%, I think. And this is just showing you, interestingly, and I find this interesting, often people disassociate Wi-Fi and say, we don't need to worry about that because the signal strengths are very low. And to put that in perspective, this is a logarithmic scale, so the bottom is a lot lower than the top. And this is a mobile phone base station emitting, that happens to be about 100 meters, which is in the maximum intensity area of this particular base station. This is a wireless laptop accessing a file or a router. And you can see that they're producing higher signal strengths than the beam of greatest intensity of that mast. And the reason I bring that to your attention is that back in 2000, the Stewart report, commissioned by the government at the time to look into this, came up with a conclusion that they felt that places where children, for example, were, should not be put in the beam of greatest intensity from these masts because of health concerns. And what we've done is ignore that report and now put higher signal strengths on children's laps inside their classrooms. But that is oversimplifying this quite a lot, because what I've been talking about there is all about power density or signal strength, and it's a lot more complicated than that, unfortunately. We know that intensity windows exist, and this is a slightly perverse concept, but what I mean by this is that because you can have intensity windows of enhanced biological activity. So let's say you move your router away from where you're working because you want to drop the intensity. You will certainly drop the intensity of radiation by moving it away and increasing the distance. But that may drop you into one of these high biological activity intensity windows, because sometimes some of the very low intensities actually have been shown to cause more biological disruption than higher intensities. And we can talk a bit more about that in question time if you'd like me to. But in addition to that, we find that there could be issues with cumulative exposure, just like smoking. That there are also frequency windows of enhanced biological activity. It's not the case. I think some people wrongly think that the higher you go up the spectrum towards the ionizing frequencies, let's say, that must do you more damage, and that's not true. We have these activity bands that seem to cause greater damage in particular systems. Whether the signal is a smooth sine wave or a sawtooth intermittent wave is important. The polarity and information carrying content, these are all things that have been shown in different studies to affect biological disruption. And some other considerations. So in real life, a lot of the experiments that are done in laboratories with a single source and a single point that you're measuring from. But if you think about it, in an office, let's say, you've got loads and loads and loads of desks. And all of those may have a phone. A lot of people have their own phone at their desk. There may be more than one router. There may be, let's say, a radiator here and a filing cabinet here. And these signals that are produced will radiate out. They will bounce off some of these things and reflect back, but they will also overlap each other. And when that happens, you might remember from your school physics that if you have identical waves and they coincide upon each other, you can get constructive interference, which will give you a higher amplitude wave. thereby increasing the intensity. Now, this is highly complex in real life because we have this in 3 dimensions. We have multiple floors, we have some base stations outside. And base stations, for example, might all be from the same company, so emitting very similar fields at certain points. Those can cross over on a really large scale and theoretically produce a line of higher intensity between them. So that's interference. Hotspots in your body, you need to think about this when you put a plate of food in a microwave. Some parts of it get really hot, don't they? Tomatoes are shockers. Everything else might be cold, and the tomato burns the roof of your mouth clean off. And that's because that has a really high water content. The different tissues in your body will absorb with different efficiencies. So, and again, you might have metalwork. There might be a girl in the classroom with braces, or somebody with a belt, underwiring in bras, coins in pockets, and these can all change the characteristics of the fields. And of course, vulnerability. We're not all designed the same. This is not us. We're not like the routers that came off the production line. Every single person will respond differently. And we know by looking at other environmental toxins that all people have very dramatically different responses sometimes, and there is inevitably a sensitive group, a super sensitive group. Questions?
I suppose it's even worse if you've got a stainless steel rod in your back.
Metalwork, that's actually on my vulnerable group slide, is prosthetics involving metalwork could change fields or conduct. Not very much work has been done on that, but it should be a concern, yeah. So I mentioned right at the beginning that I wanted to talk about cancer today. This particular slide shows a glioma. That is a type of brain cancer which unfortunately is rapidly fatal. The 5-year survival from these tumours is 0. And we have not developed treatment methods for it, unfortunately. And this is the same type of tumour that has been associated with mobile phone radiation, as has another tumour called acoustic neuroma. Acoustic neuroma is a benign tumour, a schwannoma, and it'd be useful for you to remember that word. And both of those satisfy what we call the Hill criteria for causality. So those causality criteria I introduced at the beginning. Leonard Hardell and Michael Kohlberg published this in 2013. They used these criteria to analyse that risk, looking at a number of different papers. And they felt that it satisfied at least 6 of the criteria extremely well, and the remaining 3 to some extent, which was enough evidence for them to call for this type of radiation to be reclassified as a group 1 known human carcinogen. And Leonard Hardell's work is known to have some of the best methodology in all of the studies that have been examined. So this is just him saying that this should be a group 1, and that's a reference to his paper. And things sometimes move more rapidly in courts of law. This is from the Supreme Court in Italy, where this gentleman received compensation for his brain tumour some years ago. And there's now a class action lawsuit going on in the States that's been going on for several years. Unfortunately, several of the complainants have now deceased, but the litigation continues. And at the beginning of this, the share prices for telecommunications companies dropped by 5.5 billion. This is the COMET assay, and this is one of the ways that we can try to ascertain what's happening. This looks for DNA damage. And what we do is we take a ball of DNA and we what's called electrophoresis it in an alkaline solution. Any damaged fragments of DNA are pulled towards the anode. They migrate across, leaving this comet-like tail. And you can measure the density and the length of that tail, and it gives you a qualitative or quantitative assessment of damage. This was a study called the reflex study that I think is really important, done some years ago now. On the far left there, you'll see a healthy ball of DNA that's not had any exposure. In the centre, that's DNA that's been exposed to the equivalent of about 1,600 chest x-rays. Those are alarming doses that we would associate with cancer. And here, this is DNA that's been exposed to only 24 hours of mobile phone radiation at the current allowable guidelines. Now, many of you will already be familiar with the concerns about mobile phones and brain tumours, but you may not have heard about concerns of other types of cancer. Breast cancer, I think, is really important because this is a huge public health concern. And this is John West and colleagues who published some research a few years ago now, I think this was 2013, looking at a case series. He found this very compelling because these were young women, And they all had tumours that were almost identical in terms of their histology, what you see under the microscope, and their morphology, and even their hormonal sensitivities. And what was more remarkable about these is that all of the women who had them complained to him that they had occurred directly behind where they kept their phone in their bra. Unfortunately, this number has grown quite substantially since he published this. And this is a quote from him. He said, "We know for sure there's a direct link between cell phones and breast cancer. It often takes a really long time looking at epidemiological data for warnings like that to be translated into public health policy. But I would take that very seriously from a man who's been treating breast cancer for many years." Now, it's healthy for people to be cynical, it really is. And so a lot of people will say, but we're all using this technology and it's everywhere around us. Surely, if it caused all of this harm, we'd all be ill. Well, firstly, I'd say we all know that everyone who smokes a cigarette doesn't get lung cancer. There are vulnerable groups, there are people who develop it before the others. But this was from the World Health Organization in 2002, predicting a tidal wave, I quote from them, of cancer. And you can see in dark blue the highest number of cases per 100,000. I found that quite interesting looking at that. Now, the reason why I've talked a bit more than I normally do about cancer today is because of this report. This was published only a couple of weeks ago, and I hope that this will become quite important. I have a feeling it will. I talked to you at the beginning about how RF radiation, radiofrequency radiation, was classified as a group 2B or possible human carcinogen. If it was a 2A, that would mean probable. If it was a group 1, that would mean we know it causes cancer. So the question is, what would move it up? Why didn't it go up? Why is it exactly where it is? And one of the reasons was said to be, there were a couple of reasons talked about at the time. One was that we didn't know every single step in the mechanism exposure to cancer formation. And another argument was that we didn't have robust enough animal studies. We had some quite good human epidemiological studies, but they like to have both. Now, the truth is there are thousands of animal studies on this subject, but they didn't quite fulfill the robust criteria that was needed. This is a new report that was put together by the National Toxicology Program in the States. So they've got many years of testing drugs and chemicals for carcinogenic toxicity. And they used a really belt and braces approach. They used double the number of animals they would normally use. They had a panel of 3 groups assessing their findings rather than the normal one. This was a $25 million study. So what did they find? Well, it's the largest study ever done of its type, and they used exposures that are within the allowable guidelines. They also went higher than that, which is very important. That's what we always do, because some people use their phone a bit, but some people use it an awful lot. So you need to go above the allowable guidelines. But they found glioma in these animals, the same tumour I told you about in humans at the beginning. And the other type of tumour they found was a schwannoma. They didn't find it in the brain of these animals, so it's not an acoustic neuroma. They found it in the heart of the animals. And of course, the animals weren't using their cell phones like this. They were exposed in a chamber. So a very, very interesting study. 1 in 12 male rats developed either malignant cancer of the brain or these heart tumours, or precancerous lesions, something we call hyperplasia. And there were no cancers found in the control group. Oh, and there was a dose-response relationship. This is one of the Bradford Hill criteria for causality, so it's very important. So what's very confusing is when you see a study like that, and then you see media like this. And there was a lot of media attention given to this Australian study, which recently failed to find any concerns. And one of the, well, a few explanations that I would give you are here. Firstly, it should be too soon for an expected rise in brain tumours from cell phones. It should be too soon. We know from smoking and from atomic bomb fallout, etc., that it can take many decades, up to 4 or 5 sometimes, to see the clear rises. So in fact, the fact that we can see some rises is extremely concerning. The other problem with this study is that they looked at all types of tumours altogether. Now, not all types of brain tumour will necessarily be caused by this kind of radiation. We know that quite specifically asbestos causes mesothelioma. And so if you put them all in together and some other types of tumour are dropping, then that cancels out some of the effect of ones that are rising. The other thing that happened is they looked at all sites. And unless you look at the sites that are most likely to be related to a cell phone, again, other sites in the brain can be dropping at the same time as the ones right next to where you use a phone are increasing. There's also problems with poor registration of tumours and media spin. The consequences of this socioeconomically are absolutely enormous. So this is a graph, thank you to Microwave News who added the red line to this graph that was from Ho et al.'s study in the European Journal of Cancer a couple of years ago now. And you can see this red line slowly but steadily showing a clear rise. That, I believe, is a statistically significant rise, but these other tumours, astrocytomas, etc., that is also a statistically significant drop. But when you put them all together in this bar chart, you can see there's not much of an impressive rise. Any questions about that?
Do we know who funded the study, why the study came about? Because studies just don't happen.
I knew you'd ask me that, and I was interested to know myself. I haven't checked it out yet. There are so many different studies, and some of them show harm and some of them don't. But I think it's always, and a lot of you will already know this, it's always so important to look at who funded the study, and I'll be showing a slide about that towards the end. It is relevant. We know funding causes bias. It's just a fact. We know it from drug trials, and we know it from this subject itself.
Which exposure are you talking about? Because mobile phones have many different forms of communication on them. So they've got a normal
all of those are radio frequency, and the classification is for all radio frequency fields. It's not distinguishing between different frequency types.
So they all transmit on the same frequency?
No. No, but radio frequency is within a certain set of frequency bands. I can pop back up the original slide to show you at the end, actually. I'll do that. It shows you where it is in relation to everything else. So I'll do that at the end, remind me. So I mentioned cancer, but in my opinion, it really is just a small subset of health concerns. When we're standing away from a router, all parts of our body will be irradiated, and all parts of our body will absorb at different rates. And this is a slide showing some of the areas of higher absorption in areas particularly that don't have bone shielding or where the body constricts into certain areas. I don't try and read this, please, but this is just to show you. I started collecting papers on different areas, looking at, the dermatological complaints, neuroskeletal, musculoskeletal, neurological, reproductive system, really strong literature looking at sperm and how that is affected, cardiovascular, etc. And really, I found studies that showed effects on every single system. And to just give you a very quick overview, I'm going to talk about this again in a minute, oxidative stress, so we'll jump forward. Nervous system disruption is very common to see both in animal studies and in human studies, which should not be a surprise to us because the central nervous system is highly electrically dependent. And what we see is that, amongst other things, this sympathetic nervous system can be activated. What we call our fight and flight nervous system is the opposite of our parasympathetic or our rest and digest system. And historically, it's so that you can run from a lion, which is great because that could save your life. But the problem is if something subconscious, like an electromagnetic field, is activating that system chronically over a long period of time, you have to pay for that by taking energy away from your parasympathetic nervous system, which means you're not building your immune system, you're not regenerating and healing and repairing. So that can have effects on the immune system, as can reduced melatonin production. We won't go into a lot of detail here, but it's one of your body's most powerful endogenous from inside the body antioxidants, which means cancer-fighting, anti-aging. Reproductive impairment, the literature here is very strong. And given that, again, this is a rising public health issue, I think that's highly relevant. Breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. This is a really useful area to look into if you want to have a look at some of the papers showing these intensity windows that I talked about. Leif Salford has published some excellent literature looking at albumin leakage in the brain of rats who are exposed to mobile phone type radiation. And what he showed is that when he dropped the intensity of the radiation, there was more profound albumin leakage through the damaged blood-brain barrier. Very interesting work. And many other studies, well, several other studies that I'm aware of, have now redemonstrated that effect in different ways. This could be very important looking at the rises in autism, dementias, and electromagnetic hypersensitivity. Increased glucose metabolism, there's a specific study by Volker et al. Kind of interesting because we see this increased glucose metabolism also in the brains of people with dementias. And inhibition of repair mechanisms. You can imagine, all of us are fighting cancer every day of our lives on a molecular level. And so if you have increased damage to DNA and saturated repair mechanisms that can no longer delete or correct those problems, it's not going to be long before you swing into a disease state. And in terms of what kind of illness you might expect, there's very loosely, I've put some here that I found literature on, and I tried to group some on the right that were perhaps more relevant to adults, and on the left ones more relevant in younger age groups. But what I'm really sad to say is when I first put this slide together quite a few years ago now, we are seeing all of these migrating into younger and younger age groups. Alzheimer's and dementias we're seeing in people in their 40s. And cancer, migraines, depression, insomnia, these are things that are escalating in children. Children should sleep. They should sleep like a child. And children should not be depressed. Suicide is the highest cause of death now, in young men in particular, but in between the age groups of 5 to 19. That's astonishing. We're losing this huge number of young people to sadness, and that is not normal. And electromagnetic hypersensitivity, I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. People often want to know about the mechanism, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here today, and the truth is that we don't have every step defined, and we don't have a unified accepted theory, but this is the nitric oxide cycle, and I have taken a lot of interest. This is just a slide of mine again, like the other one, looking at different systems affected. I started collecting papers that are mechanistic, looking at different cell types and interference, and there are a lot affecting a huge number of different types of cells and different aspects of the cells. But Professor Martin Paul has done some really interesting work looking at the ability of electromagnetic fields to push calcium through voltage-gated calcium channels in the cell membrane, which can set up this cycle of nitrosative stress. We know that this causes damage to bodily systems on a grand scale. So this could be extremely relevant, and I've taken a lot of interest in this. It's related to all of these different conditions, many of which you'll be very familiar with. So as a sort of lowest common denominator, it makes quite a lot of sense. There are likely to be multiple pathways involved at once, though. Now, if that's true, if it is oxidative stress that's in one of the main pathways, you'd expect to see some evidence of that in the literature. So I had a look at quite a few studies, and particularly this review of 100 studies, and 93 out of the 100 papers that they looked at showed oxidative stress. So it looks like it could be very important. Are there any questions about that section? Okay. So that was a literature review. That's kind of useful to look at a large quantity of papers in one go, and I thought I'd just show you quickly a few others. So many people, even really scientific colleagues of mine or other medical doctors, say to me, but there isn't enough evidence. I'm sure it'll come. I'm sure it'll come one day, but right now, of course, there isn't enough evidence. I really beg to differ, and I say that because we've got tens of thousands of papers now. Of course, there's some inconsistency. I discussed this at the beginning, but the majority of them, and it depends on which subsection you look at, but in many subsections, the majority demonstrate harm. And to show you that, this is a study by Hart et al. In 2007. They did a literature review that showed about 68% showing biological disruption. Another one, this is Henry Lai via Lloyd Morgan in Pathophysiology, found 67% demonstrating harm. This was a total of nearly 1,000 studies, and Ramani et al. And again, in blue, those are the ones that showed an effect, and you can see them hovering at about this 70% mark in all different species, in birds, humans, animals, other wildlife, plants even. And again, this is important in our criteria for causality. This is showing that we've got corroborating data from other life groups, which is what we would expect if we were on the right lines. This one stands out because this was 99%, 108 out of 109 papers, and this gentleman is eminent in China and submitted this to the World Health Organization some years ago. And it would be wrong of me to talk about literature reviews and not mention the Bioinitiative report. You can all look this up at bioinitiative.org. This is a very prestigious group. They have amongst them lots of medical degrees and PhDs, but also prestigiously 3 previous chairmen or presidents of the Electromagnetic Society. And they did a review in 2012 where they looked at 1,800 studies and found all of these effects, some of which we've already mentioned. And they updated this in 2014, by which time they looked at over 5,000 papers. And what they said, they came to these conclusions. Sensitive populations, including the fetus, infant, children, elderly, pre-existing conditions or chronic diseases, and those who have already developed EHS or electromagnetic hypersensitivity must be protected. Wireless laptops and other devices should be strongly discouraged in schools for children of all ages. So that was a brief look at the literature, and it is really brief, but any questions about that? Okay, I said we'd talk about vulnerable groups, and this is a subject of particular interest for me, because when you start researching this area and you start to develop your own personal concerns, you look in the world about you, those are the people that you feel most concerned about, because they're declaring right here and right now that they are suffering and there's a problem. And unfortunately, a lot of you, maybe even all of you, will fall into one of these groups or another. So children, pregnant women, not just the fetuses they carry, but they are immune suppressed, which can make them more vulnerable. The elderly, the occupationally exposed, people like me, where we have different guidelines to everyone else, we're allowed to be exposed to much higher levels as part of our job, as are, for example, people that work in the telecommunications industry sometimes. The infirm, people who are already sick, so perhaps they've got a higher background level of oxidative stress, or their repair mechanisms are saturated. People with EHS, we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. Those with high recreational use, some people are really spending long periods of their day exposed, gaming, etc. Those with body work, and I think you mentioned, was it? No, yes, it was you. Mentioned prosthetics, metal prosthetics, dental work, amalgams, RF emitting aids like hearing aids that are actually emitting RF radiation very close to your body. These could all create vulnerable groups, and I'm sure a lot more. And I'll talk about children for a moment. Again, I'm very passionate about this subject because we all have a responsibility for children, whether we have our own or not. They're often non-consenting and also non-benefiting. And that's something we have to take very seriously. It's one thing for an adult to make a decision that they're comfortable with this situation, but it's very different for a child. And we think they're more vulnerable because their skulls are thinner, for one, so they have less shielding of their delicate brain tissue. In neonates, especially very small children, they have a higher water content, so they're like those tomatoes in the microwave. They can absorb very efficiently. Their heads are smaller, so they're more fully enveloped by a field. They have a lot of stem cells in their developing systems, which we know are exquisitely sensitive to this kind of radiation. And they have a longer time ahead of them for latent effects to manifest. I mentioned that it can be, 20, 30, 40 years. Well, if you're exposed towards the end of your life, that may never affect you in a real life way. But if you're exposed in utero or when you're very small, you could be in the prime of your life when you reap some of the negative health effects of this kind of radiation. And just to throw some statistics in, a 5-year-old has been shown to absorb up to 60% more radiation, and exposures in bone marrow can be up to 10 times greater. And in response to some of this knowledge, quite rightly, the UK Department of Health have issued a warning saying that children and young people under 16 should be encouraged to use mobile phones for essential purposes only. Dubious use of the word encouraged, I think. But how many people in this room knew about this warning? That's astonishing, actually, because I thought this would be a group who probably everyone's likely to know. But that you are reflective of society. Nobody knows this. Parents don't know it. Governors don't know it. Teachers don't know it, and schools are often they're asking children to do their homework now, sometimes on mobile phones or tablets. So, and in fact, there's support for the one-on-one iPad scheme. So you must think, well, tablets must not be in the same bracket, but why would they not be? A tablet emits the same kind of radiation, but it can emit it with a higher, what we call specific absorption rate than a smartphone. So we can't give with one hand and take away with the other. There's no consistency there at all. And some people might argue, well, it's because you don't put a tablet to your head. And I would say, I don't care. You put them here, and you have sensitive reproductive organs in that place, and actually no bone shielding of the delicate organs in the pelvis and abdomen. So this to me is remarkably inappropriate. And France has now banned Wi-Fi in nurseries for children under the age of 3 and limited its use for children under the age of 6.
They were in England years ago when phones were phones, but now phones do everything. They've
Yeah.
sort of forgotten about it, haven't they?
It's gone up and down in the media, certainly. There was sort of a big rush of concern, and then there was a big effort to allay concern, and now it's gone up and down again. Recently it's, I would say, gone back up, but then...
I'm sure don't they say, no more than half an hour a day, so by issuing a statement about no more than, they're completely contradicting the one you had several slides back about the warning.
For phones, you mean, saying...
No, for
this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's right, for phones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're really saying, use these for emergencies. Oh, but use your iPad at school to do your lessons, which is obviously not an emergency. And you've got to, it's all about benefit versus risk, isn't it? Now, in a classroom, I see this as a very black and white situation, because what's the benefit? Can these children not use the internet any other way? No, of course they can. They can use it on hardwired systems that to them, they're using it pretty much exactly the same way. This is about convenience, and usually convenience for adults or teachers in the room. And yes, there's some sexy things you can do with it, but is it worth that risk?
There will also be other health and safety issues, wiring, and so they think it's less damaging not to have wiring to trip
You mean
over.
tripping over and things, yeah.
Oddly, there'll be funding issues, so they'll get some kind of grant and they'll work with the big corporations to get
Yes.
the tablets in at a certain cost.
Yeah,
So it's very complicated, isn't it? It's
Mhm.
not just
it certainly is.
Will you be talking about smart meters?
I haven't got a section on smart meters, but I can certainly, shall we see, we're doing quite well, so let's see how we go, and we can talk about that at the end, certainly.
I understand it's going to be compulsory.
We'll talk about that at the end. It's not right now.
It's not right now.
No, you have the opportunity to opt out. We'll come back to, don't let me forget, we'll come back to that, because I think that's very important, I agree with you. So I want to talk a little bit about electromagnetic hypersensitivity, because this is a field of specialist interest of mine. And unfortunately, very, very poor education and awareness, particularly in this country. So this is a personal definition that I'm using in this context, but a multi-systemic condition characterized by increased sensitivity to electromagnetic fields of increasingly broader frequency ranges at lower intensities. And what I mean by that is that as sensitivity progresses, people can become sensitive to a wider range of frequencies and therefore a lot more devices, and at lower and lower intensities. So somebody may have a problem with a computer at that range to start with, and then start having a problem with a computer all the way across the room or in another room. And it's characterized by a great deal of symptoms, very broadly encompassing every system of the body. This is exactly what we would expect from a radiation-induced illness, which can be absorbed in every part of your body and can act on a molecular level. So it should be no surprise that this has a broad range of symptoms. But classically, some of the real fundamental ones in the constellation, I would say, are insomnia, headaches, and a pressure sense sometimes in the head and ears, cardiac dysrhythmias, autonomic nervous system instability, problems with memory, tinnitus, dizziness sometimes. There's some really odd symptoms that are very unique to EHS, and that can be electric shock sensations or a feeling of sort of tremor or vibration from inside the body. And I just put this slide up very briefly to compare, because this is ionizing radiation sickness. This is what you get if you're exposed, for example, in Chernobyl. And of course, you can see from this how this also affects every system of the body. So there should be no surprise, given that they're both types of electromagnetic radiation. Now, I want to quickly move into looking at this from quite a different dimension. It makes me very sad when people think about EHS as something quite obscure that's confined to some real minority of the population, because I don't think that's the case. I think we have to open our minds to the fact that this could be happening on a much broader scale. This is a base station, a phone base station study, looking at a constellation of symptoms and how frequent they are depending on how close you live to that base station. And what you'll see from this graph is that the closer you live, the more likely you are to have irritability, headaches, sleep disturbance, depressive tendency, skin problems, visual and hearing disruption, dizziness, cardiovascular problems. Same constellation, again, in a dose-response fashion, depending on your RF exposure, in this case from this base station. And one study doesn't mean anything. You can't conclude anything from that. But this is a smart meter study for the lady here. Same constellation of symptoms: insomnia, headaches, tinnitus, cognitive disturbance in people who weren't otherwise known to have EHS. And there are loads and loads of studies now, and we can't sit here and let this slide roll because it will take too long, and there are lots more that I haven't put on the slide. But this is looking at things like how intensively you use your mobile phone handset, or how close you live to a base station, or the intensity you were exposed to in an MRI scanner, or for occupational exposures, somebody who worked on a base station and had an unusually high exposure. And all of them are showing the same constellation of symptoms. So I think what I personally have concluded from looking at these studies in some depth is that we need to open our eyes that this is something that is not some obscure illness that could be confined to a subset of people. It's possible that this could affect anyone given enough provocation or exposure. And this was a study that was done a few years ago, extrapolating a graph showing the rise in complaints of EHS. And you can see how it's showing the same sort of exponential rise that I showed you about ambient RF increases at the beginning. But this would tell us that if we carry on at this rate, that in 1 year's time, 50% of the population could be affected. Now, I think it would be unfair to say that right now 50% of people would say, I have EHS. I'm sure that isn't the case. But if we looked at and we grouped everyone who has insomnia, depression, headaches, cardiac dysrhythmias, I'm sure that we could get to 50% of the population. And then what would be very interesting is to take RF radiation away for those people and see if their symptoms disappeared. And look at how similar that graph is. Just in your mind's eye, focus on this for a minute and look at how it rises here in the sort of mid-90s. It looks very similar to this, doesn't it? And this, again, is that graph I showed you at the beginning, the rise in ambient RF exposure, along with a graph showing trends in autism. Now, this is showing a very strong temporal link, looking at the timing of the two. Temporality is the only one of the criteria that's essential, but these graphs on their own mean nothing. I wouldn't want to insult you. We can create graphs like this with all sorts of statistics that are totally unrelated. This needs to be corroborated by stronger scientific evidence, but I think it is, and I hope I've showed you some of that. It would take a long time for me to show you all of it. Anyone got any questions about EHS?
So when we look at those graphs, and go back one. So the things, actually, all the things we're looking at in terms of the disorders or the changes, etc. A lot of people talk about the stresses of modern life, the pace at which we're doing stuff, the pressure that we're doing stuff under, that we're always switched on. And you could possibly do exactly the same graph relating to those and show. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't discount either that or the other one. But because being under all those pressures and symptoms is also at the same time that we're often using or being involved with the electromagnetic whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's really hard, isn't it, to try
It
and
is hard.
which is the actual cause.
Yeah.
But they're probably all triggers, but to pull apart which is the more defining cause almost becomes
There's a very clear way to do it, though, and the way that you do it is what I said immediately after showing them, which is you have to take it away to show it.
Right, yes.
So what you then need at that point is proper controlled trials where you take people with these symptoms, you take them out of their environment, but it is still very difficult, don't get me wrong, because in real life, as you say, you have so many different exposures. You've got to keep all those identical and just take out RF.
That's going to be tough to do because half
Yeah.
of the stresses, etc., are because of the use of the items. You take away the Wi-Fi, so how else are they going to use access to information or entertainment or things like that? How else perhaps are they going to work?
Well, and this is where animal studies unfortunately become very useful. I'm not a huge fan of animal studies, don't get me wrong, but right now we're studying our children. There's a big study going on right now called the SCAMP study, looking at behaviour and cognitive function of children in school to see if it's disrupted by the fact they've got Wi-Fi in their classroom. Right. I'm not an advocate of that. I don't think that's a step forward. But if you can find mechanisms in animal studies or in cell cultures that explain these symptoms, then that can be quite corroborating evidence that we're on the right lines. I'm not saying that by taking radiation away, we would suddenly fix this large constellation of quite non-specific symptoms, because we wouldn't. You know, a lot of these have been around forever. And yes, you're absolutely right. They're related to a lot of stresses. The other thing that's very important, and I haven't focused on this for lack of time today, but there is interaction between these stresses. And so hostile chemicals, for example, can exacerbate the effects of EMF. And what I mean by that is you can have a synergistic or additive effect where 2 and 2 is 5, if you like. You can combine electromagnetic fields with certain types of hostile chemical and have the resulting injury be greater than either one in isolation. So it does become really very complex. And this is where I think things like the DNA damage studies, plus the human epidemiology, plus the animal studies, you have to put it all together to try and come to a conclusion. Now, I threw this slide in, not knowing who would have in the audience quite, but you can tell me by show of hands if you'd like to hear about this. This, the nocebo response, if right now you walked into your general practitioner or your specialist, and you said, I think I have electromagnetic hypersensitivity or EHS, you'll be highly likely to be told, don't worry, there's nothing to worry about because it's just fear. So I'm really sorry it's happening to you, but just calm down. Just don't worry about it, because you don't need to worry, because it can't actually cause any of these problems. Now, that is a huge obstacle to people here in the UK that are suffering with these symptoms. Would you like to hear a bit more about it? Yes. Have a show of hands to be sure. Yeah. Excellent, okay. So let's carry on. It's important to know, is the nocebo effect scientific? Can it actually happen? And the answer is yes, it certainly can. It's the sort of darker brother of the placebo effect that you'll all be familiar with. And what that means is, you know, the placebo is when a doctor gives a patient a meaningless tablet, something like a Smartie, and says, this will lower your blood pressure. And hey presto, the patient comes back and he has lowered blood pressure. And there was nothing that should be known to do that in the tablet. That is well known, it does happen, and we exploit it medically in the best interests of the patient. It can happen. And on the reverse side of that, and we don't talk about it very much because it's not really used in medicine and it's actually not that common, but if you give somebody the same tablet and tell them that it can have a negative side effect, there's a chance they may develop that side effect even if there was nothing in your tablet. So this is real, it's a scientific phenomenon, but the question that I want to ask is, can it play a role in EHS? And is it the cause of EHS? And those two things are quite different questions. Now, I decided to use the Bradford Hill criteria for causality that I'm such a fan of to have a look at this relationship. And what I found is that these criteria, I think, can be quite well fulfilled for the nocebo effect as a cause for EHS. And I won't go into it in detail, but to explain that a bit more, biologic gradient, for example, if you're more frightened, if you're more afraid, if you're more frightened, could that give you worse symptoms? And I think the answer is yes, it could. In exactly the same way that if I give you a tablet and say it'll make you better, the more you believe it will, that might give you a greater chance of having a positive result. But there's a problem that undermines all of these, even though they do stand up quite well to critique. Firstly, these others don't. I showed you 4 that do, and these are 4 that don't. These don't stand up particularly well at all. But none of that is actually relevant or necessary, because I told you right at the beginning that if A causes B, A has to precede B. It's the only one that is a necessary criterion. And I know through many years now of taking histories from people with EHS, that most of the time, these are technophiles, they love their gadgets, and a lot of them had absolutely no knowledge of any health concerns before they developed their symptoms. But that's meaningless to you, because it doesn't matter what I think, that's not science, is it? But this is a published paper that was published, let me find this one, not sure, 2015? So fairly recently, actually. Now, the more time goes on, it's going to be harder and harder to prove this, because knowledge and awareness of health effects is escalating. But they still showed, even with quite good awareness, that, I'll quote from them, overall symptoms appear before subjects start questioning effects of EMF on their health, which is not consistent with the hypothesis that EHS originates from nocebo responses to perceived EMF exposure. So that is showing that in this study, A did not precede B and therefore cannot be the cause of B. So if we rule out the nocebo effect and we say it looks like that is not what's causing these symptoms, then I decided to apply, let's take their word for it, let's give them a chance. There's millions of people all over the world. Some studies say 4 to 10% of the population. That's millions of people. It's far more, for example, than the number of wheelchair users in society. And they're all saying the same thing. They're saying, I'm not confused, I'm not mentally ill, I'm perfectly sane, I've got no history of problems like that. But I know that my phone is giving me headaches or my Wi-Fi is giving me headaches. So let's give them a chance. Let's look at that link scientifically. And I'm not sure if we have time to go into too much detail about this. But looking at the strength of association, so we've got dose-response effects in multiple studies, looking at studies in the general population, which would give, I think, quite a strong association there. There's consistency because there's reproducible data that's been found by multiple studies in multiple countries via multiple methods. So that, I would say, is remarkably good. Specificity, no, it shares some symptom constellations with MCS, a different issue. So we'll give that one a no, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Temporality, yes, I mean, in most cases, people, well, in all the cases I'm aware of, people's exposure did precede their symptoms. Biological gradient, again, we have dose-response effects in some of these studies, even though we actually could be forgiven for not finding them. And I say that because of these intensity windows, where actually sometimes less exposure can actually cause worse biological effect. But even though that is a bit of a get-out, we are still seeing dose-response effects in some of the literature. Plausibility, I think, is I'm so glad that's in there. This guy was so sensible when he put these criteria together. And I would say to you, what is more plausible? That potentially up to 10% of the population have become so frightened of their cell phone that they're getting pain, or that actually the thousands of studies that document molecular level effects are what's causing their pain. And it would be absurd to think that there wasn't a supersensitive subgroup to an environmental exposure, because there is in every other sense. Every time you look at environmental change, there is always a sort of bell-shaped distribution in some cases, but groups that are unusually sensitive. And we have mechanisms to explain these symptoms. I mean, I'm not sure what else you would need. I won't go into all the rest because there's a lot here to talk about, but I will mention experiment because that's the gold standard. To be fair, it would be reasonable for you to say, well, if a cell phone is causing you a headache, prove it. Close your eyes and I'll turn one on and off and tell me when you get a headache. And that's the gold standard. Now, quite a few of these, what we call provocation studies, have failed to demonstrate that. But there's good reason. When you actually examine these, if you know something about EHS and a bit of science, a lot of them have been designed ridiculously. They're not going to show anything. And on my website, I will be publishing a list of criteria that I think are essential to get a decent experimental model together. Oh, and just very quickly, this is just kind of summarising my findings when I used the Bradford Hill. You can see that we failed this one alone on temporality. This all comes out very good for electromagnetic fields, apart from on specificity, which interestingly is the weakest criterion. It is the one you least need to fulfil. And in this case, it shares symptomatology with multiple chemical sensitivity, which many physicians now believe is actually a part of a spectrum of exactly the same medical condition. So going back to experiment, if it's true, if it's real, we should be able to prove it. That is reasonable to say. And the fact is, yes, we can. Not many studies have been done, and certainly very few have been designed even vaguely well, but this is one that has better design than some of the others. This was published in the International Journal of Neuroscience in 2011. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity, evidence for a novel neurological syndrome. And I'll quote from their discussion and conclusions here. The subject demonstrated a statistically reliable somatic reaction in response to exposure to subliminal, below conscious levels, electromagnetic fields under conditions that reasonably excluded a causative role for any psychological processes. Conclusion. EMF hypersensitivity can occur as a bona fide environmentally inducible neurological syndrome. And I mentioned to you the Karl Popper principle at the beginning, which is that a theory can be falsified by one good study. But we have more than one good study. This is not all we have. There are some other provocation studies that were positive, and all of the other studies in the general population that should be considered active real-life provocation studies, plus, of course, all of the mechanistic data showing molecular level concerns. So, to answer those questions we started with, Is the nocebo response real? Yes, absolutely it is. It's scientific. Is it the cause of EHS? No, it's not. The cause of EHS is electromagnetic field exposure. Can it play a role in EHS? And this is a totally different question. And the answer is yes, of course it can. Later on down the line, and I'll give you an analogy, but let's say you touch an electric fence one day and you get zapped. And it really hurts. I've actually done this. It's really painful. And you're a bit unhappy about that. Let's say you come across another one and somebody's with you and they say, don't worry, it's switched off, and you touch it and you get another massive shock. That's quite alarming. But what's really disturbing is then somebody fills your home with electric fences and fills your place of work, and every time you go to the shops there is nothing but electric fences. You will develop a very healthy fear and avoidance type reaction to those electric fences. And if you live in fear for prolonged periods, that very negatively affects your health. It pushes your fight and flight nervous system in exactly the same way as the electromagnetic fields are pushing it. So it can even enhance the symptoms that you're getting. And you pay for that by not building things like your immune system. So yes, it can play a role later down the line, but no, it's not the cause. Any questions about that?
Do you have anything on what we can do to mitigate it?
Yes. We're getting there, we're getting there. So let's zoom on. Moving forward, that was perfect timing. Perfect timing. Yes, no, I don't want to scare anyone. So here we are moving forward. What can we do? And the answer is there's a great deal you can do. I think, and I'm not going to apologise for this because I feel like everything I'm putting out there is important and it's real. But it's very important also not to feel overwhelmed by this. There's no point in feeling overwhelmed because that would just restrict your ability to do something productive. So I'm going to talk about some really practical solutions. I'm going to have more about these practical solutions on my website as well. And I am very happy for this to be a very interactive session. How long have we got? We've got quite a nice long time ahead. So feel free to interrupt me in this bit and ask me questions as we go so that you don't forget them. Just before we do, a bit of for the cynics really, this last bit. But I do understand that for many people you'll sit there and think this cannot be true. This is ridiculous because if it were true somebody would be telling us. And I you know, you would hope that, wouldn't you? I did hope that, and I've been very naive throughout a lot of my career. But we don't have to look back very far to say this is not the first time that we've had these environmental concerns and the public weren't given adequate warning. Revenue has been put above public health policy for decades. But there's a difference here, which is that these exposures are so ubiquitous. They are affecting, as I said, non-consenting, non-benefiting groups like children. For the first time, I think, really on a high level compared with some of these other environmental toxins. So we really have to learn from these mistakes and take a more proactive approach. And somebody mentioned industry funding bias earlier on. And this was a study looked into by Henry Lai and later published, I think, by Lord Morgan in Pathophysiology. And they found that when they looked at data, if they divided it into industry-funded and not industry-funded, that the industry-funded studies would tell you with 70% certainty that you had no cause for concern. Whereas if you reversed that and looked only independent literature, all of a sudden those figures were completely reversed. Now, I think it's healthy never to look at research that comes from people who are funding the studies. I personally don't think we should be putting our policy, our public health policy, based on studies like that. But I would also say to you, on a practical level, if somebody said to you, don't worry, there's only a 30% chance that by using Wi-Fi at school, your child's health will be damaged. Is that acceptable to you? No. It's not acceptable to me. Yeah. So, and to corroborate, I'd also be sad if people thought that I'm the only person who's concerned about this. These are international appeals from doctors and scientists. This is the emfscientists.org group, and there's over 200 signatures on this appeal to the UN. It's a sad state of affairs when doctors and scientists are on their knees to businessmen and politicians, begging for protection for the health of our children. And this is another appeal. This is a statement from a Brussels group explaining that electromagnetic hypersensitivity and multiple chemical sensitivity are real and need to be addressed. And I'm one of the signatures on this. Again, they've gathered a lot now, and that will continue to grow. And in terms of moving forward, one thing that is really important is accountability, because if no one's accountable, it's very difficult to facilitate change. And all of a sudden, when somebody is accountable, it's amazing how much more notice they pay to the literature. But who is it? And this is quite confusing, because the wireless groups, the telecommunications industry, have diminished their responsibility by publishing a lot of public health warnings. In their manuals, you will find loads of warnings. If you press the little info button on your phone, this is the Vice President saying that he wants to be clear that industry has never said this technology is safe. And then these were all quotes from various different manuals, and there were loads saying, oh, you've got to hold it at least 1.5 millimeters away from your body. And I love this loose term of the word body, because if you're holding it, you're touching it, and your fingers are kind of important. And these various distances vary quite a lot, and you shouldn't keep it in a metal holster. There's loads of different, but who reads the instructions, you know? And in terms of insurance, so these are people who, in terms of risk analysis, it's their raison d'etre. They're really good at it. And if they are flying like birds before a storm, that to me is extremely important. And I challenge everyone in this room to find an insurance underwriter who will insure for the health effects of radiofrequency fields. I haven't found one. Doesn't mean they're not out there, but I haven't found one.
Does that mean if you've got a brain tumour and you've got life insurance, they won't pay out then? Or?
Find out. It would depend on your policy, but I haven't, yeah.
Not if you say that was the cause.
Yeah, you'd have to prove it.
Yeah.
All of these different groups of scientists and doctors have made declarations, and I'm sure there are plenty more, but from all over the world. We have all these different types of evidence. We have all of it. And in answer to, oh, this is a slide, we didn't do this bit, so I'm going to move on. But I am concerned that we've lost track of good scientific integrity and good medical practice, and quite frankly, common sense in this scenario. And I want to quote lastly again from Austin Bradford Hill. He said all those years ago, scientific work is incomplete. And by its nature, we all know that it always is. That does not confer upon us a freedom to ignore the knowledge we already have, or to postpone the action that it appears to demand at a given time. So, moving into something I hope practically useful for you. I divide up the way that we should move forward loosely into two categories. Firstly, prevention. It should always be our prime directive in terms of healthcare. And then managing the things that we cannot prevent. So, of course, if there's something that is toxic, then you take away the toxin first and foremost. That is what makes sense. So reducing exposure to all of the things that can emit this kind of radiation. And I term that avoidance. So reducing your exposure, we'll call that avoidance under A. Now I put this together because with my background in emergency medicine, one of the things that we really like is mnemonics, because it helps focus you. It gives you a framework when things are complex and stressful. So A is for avoidance, and not just of electromagnetic fields, but I would say also toxic exposures that can be synergistic, or stress that in other ways that can be synergistic. And then I've moved on, I've gone A to H's, I call this fondly, but all of these are also useful for managing the things that you can't change, so improving your robustness, your resilience. And I'm kind of guessing, since we're here at CNM, that this might be a bit like teaching grandmothers to suck eggs. So I'm not going to go into huge detail here about optimizing health, but keep it in mind. I'm going to talk a lot more about avoiding EMF instead to start with. So general principles of avoidance. It's important to think outside the box. And I mean this both creatively and also on a very practical level. When I say creatively, we have all been sucked into a kind of life dogma. And it is amazing the look on people's faces when you say, use your phone for emergencies only. They're horrified. And in fairness, some people, it's part of their work structure, etc. But you do have to release yourself from some of the structural dogma of society that we've become entwined in. And on a more practical level, I mean think outside of the building that you're in, the box that you're in, because a lot of these fields have no respect for walls. It's not just about what you can see, it's also about what's outside of that box. Oh, wow. Okay. Now, these are things that you can't see or taste or smell, or most people can't. So in order to reveal them to you, you can't reduce exposure to something that you can't measure. So I've just put a couple of meters here, which actually I have on the desk here if anyone wants to come up and have a quick look if we have time. And I would like to be very clear about the fact that I do not derive any funding from the sale of anything. So these are just meters that I happen to have used myself and found useful. And it is useful to look at two parts of the spectrum. And that is the radio frequency, microwave frequency that I talked about with the mobile communication devices. But also, I think, and that's what I use this one for, is looking at household electrical frequencies. They are also a group 2B carcinogen, beyond the scope of our lecture today, but I think also very important for health. And you ideally should reduce exposure to both of them. So those are the two types of meter that you can use to look at those two parts of the spectrum. And I'm going to start off with bed space, because your bed space is the sanctuary where you do a lot of healing and restoring of your body, and good sleep is absolutely essential to good health. And alarm clocks are a big problem. People often have the ones you plug into the wall. Those can have quite a high low frequency field from the wiring, or people use their phones when they're active. Now I would say it's not actually that bad to use your phone as long as it is in flight mode. So before you go to bed, put it in flight mode, and that will disable all of the radio frequency emissions from the phone, and there are often, I think, 4 or 5 in some of the modern smartphones. It will disable them all. There is, of course, still a small electromagnetic field from the battery in the phone. So I would still advise that it's not close to your head. Sunlight is the best alarm, but not all of us have that luxury. Mechanical alarms can have quite a loud tick. Some of the LED colour temperature bulbs might be an option. LCD battery powered again can have very small electromagnetic fields. These are all options, just don't have ones that have high fields like plug-in alarm clocks or active EMF, active RF phones. A bit more about your bed space. So because I mentioned that you want to stay away from even the household wiring type fields in your bed space, it makes sense to move away things that could be picking up a field from your wiring. Things like lamps, hairdryers, TVs, phones. Dimmer switches can have quite a strong electromagnetic field. The wall wiring even, for people who are quite sensitive, that wiring that often runs behind your bed for your bedside lamps or hairdryer, that can be a problem. And bear in mind, think outside of your box, think about the floor, the lighting circuitry in the floor underneath. You might have a great big light right underneath you that could have quite a high field just above it in your bed space. Fuse boxes and transformers, sometimes that is right behind somebody's bed because it's on the other side of the wall. And smart meters will come in here. In blocks of flats, for example, there may be a whole bank of smart meters right behind your bed if you're on the other side of the wall from it. Fridge, computers, router, stereos, these are likely to be in other rooms, but they may again be in the room next door or just below you. So it's good to really disconnect these, and I'll go a step further in a slide that I've got to come. It's also sensible to avoid things that conduct electromagnetic fields into your bed space, so metal mattress springs, metal bed frames, metal in your jewellery, dental work and prosthetics. I realise not everyone can avoid, but some people will deliberately go for other types of implants. And you can get some high static fields off synthetic fabrics and things, so I often advise people on things like organic cottons and silks.
Sorry, so for things like the wall wiring, which is kind of stuck really sometimes.
I'm moving on.
Okay.
I think I'm going to answer your question, so give me a second.
Okay. I was just going to ask, so your light downstairs, if you turned it off, is the electrical charge still happening? If you turn off the things that are plugged into your wiring, does that help at all?
So it does help, but it doesn't totally mitigate the field. Now, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, because I think we've got time and I think you're going to be more interested in some of this. I will actually deliberately add some slides back in that are hidden. Let me find them. So I have one. We'll keep this on, and I'll just find them as we. So let me come back to that in a second because I've got another slide for it. Thinking of safer computer and tablet use flight mode. Flight mode is absolutely great, it's your friend. It will disable in both laptops and phones all of the radio frequency, as I mentioned. Don't forget to disable your Wi-Fi in the control panel if you don't have flight mode. For a desktop or something, it might not have it, or an older model. You have to go into your control panel and deliberately disable your wireless card. And there's no point in doing that unless you're also going to disable the emissions from your wireless router and then plug it in via an Ethernet cable. This can be different for different makes and models, and it can be quite difficult to achieve, so you're best off using your meter to be sure that you've achieved it. Quite often it looks like it's not working, but actually it's still emitting. That little button on the front, by the way, that says Wi-Fi off, that often does not switch your Wi-Fi off. So it just makes it so you're not visible on the network, but actually people can still find you on the network if they have the right access. Grounding of systems. So, and I'll mention two things here. It's good to unplug, if you're using a computer, unplug it from the mains while you're using it, and then have it charging when you're not using it, because that will dramatically lower the low frequency fields coming from it, and ensure that everything is grounded. Some computer systems are grounded via their power supply and others aren't, and you should be able to find this out from the manufacturer, or again using your meter. It should have lower fields if it's well grounded. I mentioned flux, screen color changing software, because I mentioned all aspects of the electromagnetic spectrum can affect health, and light most certainly can. It's quite a powerful biological agent. And blue-white light, the type that commonly comes off computer screens and phones, is well known to have quite a profound effect on melatonin secretion. Melatonin, I mentioned, was this very powerful antioxidant that you make in the middle of the night. You make it usually about 4 o'clock in the morning, it peaks. Now, if you have been exposed to that colour of light at a point in the day when you shouldn't have been, that colour of light comes in the middle of the day if you're outside, when it's really white and blue, pale blue out there. Late in the evening and early in the morning, the light should be the long wavelengths of orange and gold and red. And what this software does is it automatically changes your computer screen emissions through the day. I'm not suggesting it emulates, therefore, a natural spectrum, because it still won't, but it's probably better to try and protect your melatonin secretion than if it isn't. And to show you how powerful this is, a study has shown that if you even look at one tiny little blue LED on something like a video recorder, I'm showing my age there, aren't I? In the middle of the night, it will switch off your melatonin production like a light bulb. Limit screen time. It's really not healthy to sit on screens at all anyway for long periods of time, but particularly not in the evening. And don't disregard the role of the low frequency fields. That's why I mentioned unplugging it. This, I can actually walk you through how to do it, but I won't yet. If you want to, I will do that, but it's fairly straightforward. You go into Device Manager, you find your wireless card, and you press disable and then accept. Safer phone use. So I've mentioned flight mode already. Don't carry your phone on your body. This is actually written in your manual. So please don't do this. Men often carrying them in their trouser pockets, irradiating their reproductive organs. Ladies sometimes in their bra, sometimes in their pocket. If you have to carry a phone, ideally have it in flight mode and switched off, and consider having it in a bag. So flight mode will disable the radio frequency emissions, but there will still be some activity from things like the switched mode power supply in the screen, for example. If you're going to be really belt and braces about it, people would say actually take the battery pack out of the phone. Now, some phones you can, some phones you can't. But by switching it off and putting it in airplane mode, you're doing as much as you can to disable all of the different types of EMF emissions that will come from it.
But if you're off, you don't need flight mode to be off. Because it's off.
Sorry?
If it's off, you don't need to be in flight mode.
Not entirely true. There are some models of phones, apparently, that even when they're switched off, if they're not in flight mode, they will still check in with the base station every something like 8 minutes, surprisingly. So that's why I add that in. Sorry? No, I don't. If you feel that you have to use a mobile phone, then I would say use speakerphone. Some of the modern ones have really excellent speakerphones, and put it as far away from you as you possibly can, ideally so you're not touching it on a table or something. Or if for background noise or privacy you can't do that, think about an air tube headset which at least isn't conducting the energy right to your ear. Certainly not a Bluetooth headset, because that's emitting the same sorts of frequencies right in your ear. Landlines. People sometimes don't associate this radiation with landlines, but those walkabout cordless phones, of course, are using the same types of communication fields. And some people would argue that these are even worse for your health. Why? Because they emit continuously, whether you're using them or not, for most models. So what I recommend personally is a hardwired conference calling speaker phone. And the reason I say that is because if you have a decent speaker and microphone, you can still hands-free and wander about and do the cooking or whatever without having anything at all near your head. Second best to that would be an old-fashioned corded landline. You still have a low frequency field very close to your brain, but none of the radio frequency fields. And then lastly of all, if you really feel you have to use a cordless phone, consider what we call an EcoDect Plus model. What that means is that it has adaptive power control so that when you're not using it, it will down-regulate its emissions. It shouldn't be emitting RF at all if you're not using it, and when you are using it, it will use the lowest amount necessary. Okay, now this is the slide that I had wanted to definitely show you. I think this comes back to your question. I would personally say take any symptoms very seriously. If you or someone you love or someone you're trying to treat as a health practitioner has symptoms that you think could be electromagnetic hypersensitivity, obviously conventional treatment first is absolutely reasonable. But at the same time as that, I would take it seriously, and I say that because very mild symptoms of electromagnetic hypersensitivity can escalate incredibly fast in some individuals to a point where they have a life-changing, debilitating condition that cannot be reversed. Even severe cases, you can completely take away their symptoms in a completely pure and natural environment, but the minute you put them back in an environment with hostile chemicals and or hostile electromagnetic fields, they will become ill again. So if you don't want to get to that point where you're not reversible, then it makes sense to take symptoms seriously. And so for people who think they're already having problems with this, I would go a step further than everything I've just said and consider getting medieval and doing things like turning off your circuit breaker at night. Go to your fuse box and just turn everything off. Now, if you're not comfortable turning your fridge freezer off, some people are a bit funny about that. Actually, in England, it doesn't usually get warm enough to be a problem. But if you really don't want to turn that off, leave that ring main on, but check by measuring your bed space that it's not creating a field in your bed space. And you can consider a gas-powered fridge or freezer if you really want to leave it on but get all of the power off. You can use things like demand switches that will deactivate circuits when you're not using them, because even if the lights aren't on, there's a little current that goes back and forth continuously. You can stop that happening with a demand switch when the light's not on. I've already mentioned using your cell phones for emergency and ensuring that you have no RF coming off your work systems. Some people, when they get very sensitive, can never use a computer again, whether or not it's got RF or not. They're just too sensitive to those very small fields. And for those kinds of people, non-EMF ways of cooking and heating, for example, become very important. If anyone's wants to know more about that, ask me, but otherwise I'll kind of move on.
What is it, gas cooking then?
So something like, for example, a gravity-fed oil fired Arga or Essie or Rayburn, something like that, or a solid fuel.
That's the only safe one. Not so what's wrong with gas?
Gas is okay too. The problem with gas for some people is that a lot of people who have EHS also have MCS. It's very common. And natural gas can be a very provocative trigger for that, but not for everyone, so it depends on their own. ELF filtering. This is putting filters in your household wiring to get rid of some of what we call the dirty electricity or harmonics on the wiring. Some people who are exquisitely sensitive feel a field off of the device itself because it does produce a small electromagnetic field of its own. But if you want to filter, you can put it kind of at the source where everything comes in and shield the device. But that's something that is felt by some people to really help health. And consider shielding. Now, shielding is a bit of a dark art. This is a bit more. I think we've covered most of this. So I'm not going to go through this slide carefully again. In terms of shielding, this is highly complex and often doesn't work even in expert hands, is the truth. But if it does go well, it can also dramatically improve people's health in some cases, especially when they have EHS. These are some pointers that I think will be useful for you. If you can, aim for natural shielding, and I'll come back to that with some examples in a minute. You need to know what you're shielding against, because different materials will shield different frequencies and intensities. And I really do recommend expert advice when it comes to this. Always use meters before and after, otherwise you don't know that you've achieved what you think you've achieved. Beware of very high expenditure. Some of the fabrics can be very expensive, and sometimes you will fail in what you're trying to achieve. And beware of things like reflection, because, for example, some of the shielding paints people have used, and then they've got household wiring or devices inside, and if those are reflective paints, everything's bouncing back at them. So that can cause problems of its own. Learn about the properties of the material. Again, you don't want to be hypersensitive to something else that's in your shielding material that can happen. Consider whether it needs to be grounded or ungrounded, which depends on the fabric. I've put here, beware of shielding natural EMF. Don't worry too much about that, because it's actually really hard to achieve. But for people who are very sensitive, who, for example, try to build their house underground or in a hillside, ground is an excellent natural shield of EMF. But you do actually run the risk of shielding, in that case, something called Schumann resonance, which is a natural background EMF that helps cue our biorhythms. And so in extreme circumstances, if you're successful in doing that, you can make yourself very ill, but it's quite hard to do. And light, of course, sunlight. It is very important to get natural, unadulterated, full-spectrum sunlight at certain points in the day, especially. Note symptoms before and after. Your body will help you. It won't always tell you the truth, but it will help you to know if what you've done is helping or not. I mentioned natural shielding. These are all different substances that I have tested myself and found to be quite good. This is limestone at the top left here. It can be quite expensive though, but it seems to be an excellent shielding material. Cheaper down here is timber. Now, timber on its own is generally not very good. A colleague of mine, a building biologist, Isaac Jameson, suggested charred larch, for example. Charring it produces carbon, and carbon is highly conductive and can be an excellent shielding fabric of its own. So if you produce a nice, thick, healthy char, and then you ground that especially, you could end up with quite nice shielding from that. This is mud, good old mud. People who live in clay areas can literally dig this out of their garden and mix it with straw and build a house out of it. And I know this is true because I've done it. And it can work extremely well. It has a water content, it's grounded, and some of the big, thick cob walls, for example, could offer excellent shielding. Straw bale, this is another thing that I've tried myself. Straw bales on their own don't necessarily do a lot, but when you do this, which is what you need to do to protect them, cover them in nice heavy lime plaster. You've got the same lime as you've got in this limestone. You can produce quite strong shielding there. And then lastly, concrete here. Not one of my favourite substances, but to be fair, it can shield, and again, it's got a water content which allows it to be nicely grounded and a bit cheaper than some of the others. Rammed earth is another one I'll be looking into. It depends what you're ramming it with, but that could also be excellent. Now, we're coming to the end of avoidance, but one thing I'll just say last of all, and we can't get into the science of this, but because the nitric oxide cycle is one of the things that is felt to be playing a role in electromagnetic hypersensitivity, it is sensible to try and avoid other things which trigger that cycle, because they could therefore make the condition worse. That's all I'll say at this point. And for more information about this, the best person to look for resources with is Professor Martin Paul. So that was all on A for avoidance. B to H is, we're going to whiz through, but stop me at any point. It's all really common sense, this part, I think, mostly. It's about optimizing your resilience, your background body health. If oxidative stress is one of the things causing the damage, we all know that there are ways of combating that and helping yourself to be stronger. And I'll start with B, we'll go in order. B is about breathing fresh air. And air ionisation can be quite dramatically changed in buildings that use things like AC heating and air cooling systems. And that can change particle sizes, and all of that can have quite a negative effect on health. And interestingly, when we see desert winds and things that bring in a high concentration of positively charged ions, you can see the same constellation of symptoms in those people that can be reversed by breathing negative ion-rich air. Now, you'll find this naturally in most outdoor healthy environments, especially around water droplet formation. But I'm not here necessarily recommending negative ion generators. I'm not convinced personally that those are creating molecules that are totally natural. There's a lot we have to learn about things like resonance and spin and molecules in general. So get it the natural way by opening a window, which is difficult if you're in an area of high pollution. But
What about salt lamps?
yeah, those are all, they're using electricity for a start. And anecdotally, some people with EHS have really noticed a negative difference in a room that has used one of those. So it's not scientific. I'm not giving you any science either way, but I'm not personally convinced that they're helpful. I think try and do it the most natural way that you can. C, I've put for creative cognitive care, and this subject has to be addressed very delicately because it's very easy for people to misunderstand what I'm trying to say here, but I'll try and put it as simply as I can. Because electromagnetic fields can drive your fight and flight nervous system, anything else that also does that can physically make symptoms worse. So if somebody has a headache because they've been on a phone or by their Wi-Fi router all day, and then somebody comes in and they have a big argument and they're upset and physically distressed, both of those two things are triggering the same part of their nervous system, and the headache will physically get worse. So you have a degree of voluntary control over how your body is reacting. And for some people, particularly who feel that at this point in time they can't get into an excellent environment, this is a really useful thing that you can take control of yourself and say, regardless of my environment, whether it's hostile or not, I am going to put myself in the most positive, relaxed, calm physical state that I can. You are manipulating your nervous system to allow itself to build your immune system, for example, and to diminish some of those triggers. And there's some very interesting work that's been done by a few groups looking at what we call neural reprogramming or training, which I think is really interesting. I'm not trying to say that that will change DNA damage if that's what EMF is doing on a molecular level, but it can certainly change the long-term impact on your physiology, which could be extremely useful indeed. And a lot of people who are very sensitive and have severe EHS are living in fear, and they're having to live in a very confrontational environment. So this is difficult, but I think it could really, really help if people can focus on positive parts. And this is just an advice sheet that I'll make available on my website. Oh gosh, there's a lot of it. Dental care, very briefly, mercury amalgams could in theory be conducting electromagnetic fields very close to your brain. Also, mercury itself is toxic. This was a big mistake, putting this in people's mouths. And it's one that's quite difficult to undo, because when you try and take the mercury out, you can release a lot of mercury back into the central nervous system. So you need, if you want to get them out, you need a really savvy dentist who will use the best techniques of their time. And previously that's been things like rubber dams and vacuum extraction to minimize the amount of mercury that you're exposed to when they take them out. And I would want to know quite a lot about the replacement substitute substance as well if I was you. This is quite, yeah, you want to talk to a good environmental dentist about it. If you feel that you've been made worse by mercury release following it, you can consider something called chelation that will, if we have time, we can talk a bit more about chelation. For those of you that don't know, it comes from the Greek word meaning crab's claw, because it means giving your body a substance that can bind to a toxin and then help you excrete it. And you can do this for mercury. The problem is that often they're not utterly specific to what they bind to. So it can bind to a number of different things and leach your body of some quite positive things at the same time. I personally advise people generally to have some what we call provocation testing to look and see if they really do have a toxic load, and that can be difficult. But it's more sensible to only do it if you know for sure you have got a toxic load before you start, and then to be under the care and supervision of somebody that can follow you up very carefully and make sure that you're not leaching other important substances at the same time.
What did you say, provocation test?
Yeah, so a provocation test, it means trying to look for whether you definitely have an excess of that. So for example, giving a small amount of a chelation agent and then measuring the output of that binding to, for example, mercury or whatever heavy metal or toxin you're looking for, to try and get an idea of whether you really have got an overload or not. Exercise is sensible for anybody, and again can help you keep your nervous system in the right place, and you can combine it with a lot of the other things ideally that are good, so some sunlight, some grounding, etc., etc. Be careful, those with chronic fatigue syndrome, and get advice. Food, and this is where I'm thinking of grandmothers and eggs, because I reckon there could be a lot of people in this audience who are experts on food, and I'm not. But one thing I would say is that there's lots of different weird and faddy diets out there at the moment, but nobody disagrees generally that lots of fresh organic vegetables and fruits are healthy for your system. And I would certainly reiterate that, because they're high in antioxidants, which will start to combat this oxidative stress. And there are some big long lists of food types I've put together that I think could be particularly useful, and again I'll try and get those on the website when I can. We'll whiz through that. Grounding, so it's very important to ground your electrical systems, and you are an electrical system, and there is a concentration of nerve endings at the base of your second toe that some people believe is deliberate, because when you are barefoot outside, that is the part of your foot that is always in contact with the ground even when you're running, and could allow really excellent grounding. We know that we can pick up charge and static in modern life especially, and you can dissipate that just by walking outside on healthy terrain, and that could be wet grass, or it could be concrete that leads directly to the earth. Salt water or sea bathing is excellent, and actually for people with EHS, quite often, quite simply, a bath or a shower can alleviate all their symptoms sometimes immediately.
Sorry, what about electrical showers?
Interestingly, and again, this isn't scientific, but what people say is that regardless of whether it's an electrical shower, they usually feel better when they're in the water.
Because the water's been grounded anyway.
I guess. It's a difficult one. Nobody's done a large-scale study on it, and it probably depends on... The other thing is that people aren't generally massively highly exposed to the electricity from their shower system, and people with EHS are notoriously most sensitive to things they've had very high exposures to. So a bit like hairdryers. Hairdryers, even though they have a very high electromagnetic field, are not a common trigger for EHS. I think mainly because people don't stand there for hours on end. It's a fairly quick process. So hydration, talking about water. Hydration is very important, but you mustn't overhydrate. That can cause hyponatremia or decreased sodium, which actually the symptoms of that can mimic EHS in itself. So don't go crazy with the water, but it is sensible to have quite pure water if you can. Some people that are very sensitive will develop sensitivities to the chlorines in tap water, or some of the other chemicals now in tap water, or in plastics, the plastics that have leached out of plastic bottles and things. So some would advocate glass bottled spring water. Sleep. Now, the only reason this towards the end is because it starts with an S, so I had to put it at the end in my A to H's. But sleep, really, in my opinion, should be right next to avoidance and food. Sleep is absolutely essential. And to put it very crudely, it doesn't take very many days without sleep before you just die. But what happens to you during that time is very similar to the same symptoms we see in the broken neurological system of somebody with EHS exposed. Very similar indeed. And you can, if you're not careful, you can end up with this kind of vicious cycle. People who are very sensitive often suffer insomnia, and the more tired they become, the more sensitive they become. So you absolutely, I cannot stress it enough, have to break this cycle for good health. And you will not regain good health unless you break this cycle. And to give a few tips, again, I'll put this on my website, but lots of these things address different aspects of having a good, healthy sleeping environment. And some of them are not about RF radiation, but this one about light is very important. The quality of light in your environment, especially near bedtime. So, well, yeah, you can all go through that in more care in your own time. S also is for sunlight. And there's a sort of epidemic of vitamin D deficiency. There's also a bit of an argument about whether that's just poor sunlight exposure, or whether in fact there are other reasons for vitamin D depletion because of usage within the body. And that's a complex debate which I won't get into. But vitamin D is certainly important. It helps you absorb calcium. And if you need to optimize your natural daylight, especially first thing in the morning, you need to get a bit of UV light, and then ideally 10 to 15 minutes a day to keep optimal vitamin D levels. Be very careful of unusual lighting in the evening, as I've mentioned, especially with things like compact fluorescent bulbs. Compact fluorescent bulbs have a very unusual spectrum, and it's not good for health. People with EHS are classically extremely sensitive to them, or they can be in some cases, and you don't want those, especially in the evening. They can also put out some microwave and radio waves. Sauna I'm not going to talk about in detail, but some treatment centres use sauna to help for toxin excretion. I would say for people with severe EHS, you want that to be a non-electric sauna, so you can get it very hot with electricity if you want to, but then turn everything off and sit in there once everything is switched off. Additional, oh no, we didn't need to go into this, okay. Right, I'm going to pop out of that. Okay, this very, very briefly. This is looking at adjuncts to all of this. If you've gone through all of that, I would say if you've gone through your A2Hs and you're still not well and you're still suspicious that it could be electromagnetic fields or something similar, do it again. Because quite often you've missed something when you've gone through, particularly a source of EMF that you didn't think about. So go back through it several times before you move on to these which are more invasive. But again, some treatment centres, and I don't provide treatment for EHS, that's not what I do, but I know that some doctors who do advocate nutritional supplements. I would say be careful. Again, ideally make sure that it's something you are in fact depleted in, and if there's a more natural way of getting it through your diet or with vitamin D with sunlight, I would advocate that first. Immunotherapy is something that, again, some hospitals advocate, not necessarily with the goal that it will directly help electromagnetic sensitivity, but more commonly it can decrease the chemical sensitivity side, and that in turn can allow your whole inflammatory system to relax a bit and therefore be less sensitive perhaps to EMF. Autogenous lymphocytic factor, that's something that they're doing in the States right now. That's William Ray's clinic in the States. Chelation I mentioned, this is getting rid of toxins like metals, which there's not strong literature here, but of course it does make some sense that people with very high body metal loads may be more conductive.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Immunotherapy really, with vitamin C injections.
I don't believe that's part of immunotherapy specifically, but some of the clinics that do immunotherapy also do give vitamin C injections.
Is that good or bad then?
I wouldn't comment on that. That's outside of my field of expertise. Checking for mold, radon gas and EMF, and the reason I put that in is because there are other environmental toxins that can give quite a similar spectrum. The truth is that when you look at environmental illness, there's a lot of similarity, sometimes regardless of the trigger. So, and they all attack, they can fuel each other in a synergistic way. So it's sensible to look for some of the others at the same time. And then pharmacology, I would absolutely leave until the very end, because no drug is without its side effects. And that's a bit of a word about supplements. And we're coming towards the end, really. This was nitric oxide cycle triggers, a bit about chelation. Those are some of the different agents that you can use for chelation immunotherapy. These are some other things that are recommended by some, generally quite alternative, and my training is not in alternative medicine, so I'm not specifically advocating these, I'm just telling you that they're out there and some people are using them. I have particular interests in neural biofeedback, neuroplasticity training and hydrotherapy, because I think they could be quite useful for people who are unable to avoid. These are some of the pharmacological agents that have been used by some. Now, getting to sort of the crux of my summary, really. One of the things I think is an important sort of take-home message is that you can limit your exposure. You can reduce your exposure. But I personally see that as being a little bit like smoking a low-tar cigarette, potentially. And when it comes to non-consenting, non-benefiting groups like children, then I think really we should be aiming to totally omit the ambient radio frequency fields in their environment. So These are ways you can reduce your exposure, minimizing the use, replacing devices, using adaptive power control, getting the maximum distance. Now this drops the intensity quite dramatically because the intensity is a factor of the square of the distance. So a small bit away will drop your intensity quite a lot. But I explained earlier why I don't think we can consider that 100% protective. And of course consider ELF fields. Avoiding max power situations, what I mean specifically by that is the classic using a mobile phone in the car, which none of us should be doing anyway, but even if they're plugged in and you're using hands-free, if the aerial is inside the car, if you're not plugged into an external aerial, then because you're moving through different tower zones, your phone will be on max power for a lot of that time, which isn't sensible. So I think if you are looking at defensible protection, I think we should be switching off devices, using airplane mode, shielding and swapping devices to ultimately get to the point where we have withdrawn all RF emissions in our environment. And in summary, and thank you so much for, I'm amazed at the level of attention all the way through because I know it's been a long time, but you've really done well, thank you. We're electromagnetic, that's how we work. All life is electromagnetic. And non-thermal, non-tissue heating electromagnetic fields can do damage at surprisingly low intensities. Present safety standards kind of don't exist, frankly, but they're not protective. You can lower your personal exposure by doing a number of things, specifically using hard wiring and airplane mode. You can optimize the rest of your health to be more resilient to negative health effects. You can request protection for those responsible for your environment and help to educate those people. And I think this is a really important part of what I'm hoping my group FIRE will be trying to facilitate. And I feel that we all have a duty to immediately be lowering our emissions to help protect vulnerable groups, of which there are many.